Good evening. This is Keisha Naima Robertson. I'd like to welcome you to the digital space that I'd like to call the Fruitful Lotus. This is the first installment, and actually, it's a re-record. I didn't even need to tell you that, but I recorded it and I made a mistake, and so I have to re-record it. And I've already recorded the other videos. I shifted my process and how I do things, how I was recording. So this is supposed to be the first video, and I'm just okay. So the idea is I'm just gonna let it flow if I make mistakes. But the mistake I made in the first video was kind of important and I don't have the ability to edit just yet. So I had to take down and redo the whole video. So what is the purpose of this space that I'm creating? It is to discuss issues of social emotional development, creative, socio-political, and as well as personal development overall, just all the components of personal development. Right now I'm going to kick off the space with a 7-part reflection series on the miseducation of the Negro, and by Carter G. Woodson. And I keep saying this book that I read. Obviously, I read the book. I don't mean it like that. And it's so funny because I'm so hypercritical of myself because I try to anticipate whatever people could possibly think just to let them know that I'm aware that I make mistakes. But the fact of the matter is I make mistakes. You may listen to the videos and you may hear little mistakes and stuff like that. I speak with my hands. Please do not assign any value unless I tell you to, because I do it all the time. I talk with my hands. I do whatever, and I don't mean anything by it other than the fact that I speak with my hands. We'll work on that. And actually that was the mistake I made in the video. I still had the book in my hand, and I didn't want it to be confused or misread in any way, so I had to redo the video. But anyway, the important point that I want to get to is that the purpose, I already talked about the purpose. My goals are the 7-part series was the first goal. I have a few other ideas that I'd like to kind of discuss. Each time the video will be somewhere between 25 and 30 minutes, maybe even shorter. And it's just a discussion. I'm just inviting you into my process. I'm going through some mental health diagnoses. I'm going through some misunderstandings that I have with myself. Definitely growing out of some miseducation. And I think other people are doing it as well. And so even if my insight you don't find to be relevant or insightful in terms of informing your perspective, I think even in my errors or mistakes, you can find some sort of impetus to further explore your personal identity and the components thereof. So I think sometimes my comments can be kind of misread as confused or convoluted with regard to racial allegiance, racial allegiance, I should say. I am certainly a proponent of the empowerment of the Black community, and I am a Black woman, born and raised in the United States, and so I am certainly not trying to do anything contrary to any movement that would uplift or encourage Black bodies to maintain Black spaces in which there is healing. So let me just say that. So some of the features will basically be prayer, hymnals, inspiration, and meditation, maybe even from time to time. Just any opportunity for healing. So I just like to encourage you in that way. And then some of the people who I learned from a number of people. Russell Simmons, Iyanla Vanzant, Joyce Meyer are some of the people, like Joyce Meyer and Iyanla Vanzant. I have read several of their publications, several of their book titles. And Russell Simmons, I listened to for some of his spiritual wisdom. I know he had a book previous. I think it was Do You, but I haven't read it completely. Even though he was doing lecture series, I think that was in the early 2000s. I think he came to Maryland. I graduated from the University of Maryland, College Park. I am a mother. I'm also a performance poet, and that's pretty much that. So. let me get into it. So the very first one, the first installment that I'm going to do, and this video will be quite shorter than the original video, in that I'm just going to look at these first two reflections that I had. So what I did with the book is I read it, and of course I annotated it, and then I just basically broke down the four dominant themes, which are economics, education, spirituality, socialization, and political action. And then what I did is when I finished reading the entire book, I just started jotting down some notes, like to kind of figure out, okay, so what am I going to do with this? How am I going to apply the information? And I went from there. So the interesting thing is, so the interesting thing is, like, books like this nowadays, like, I think Black cultural studies has come under such scrutiny because, yes, we talk about Black Lives Matter, we talk about how important that is, in terms of like buzzwords and like pushback, like acceptable pushback against the dominant mainstream narrative, which is, society is healed. Racism is almost like this crutch that we're holding on to, and that when there are incidences of racial injustice, those are isolated events and not necessarily a reflection of the systemic racism that it actually is in terms of general climate and psyche. And so I think that it's just important to be able to recognize that. I think that it is, in fact, our society still has a lot of dis-ease, especially psychological dis-ease, around the remnants of slavery and what it has done, from now, like present, I mean, from past on present. And Carter G. Woodson has done an amazing work in terms of carving out some space for there to be cultural explanation. And there have been several other scholars that have also picked up the helm and continue to do the same work. And so it's important, and it's important that we value it and we recognize it. So while the book is not specifically about behavioral health, what the book is about is understanding some of the psychological ramifications, of mismanaged diversity. And so, in terms of the Black experience in America, we were forcefully brought from Africa to America and under brutal conditions. And it was, regardless of what position you had prior to coming to America, that no longer mattered. What mattered, was the function that was assigned to you as a piece of property. And I think that created this psychological trauma, and people don't want to call it that. They want to say it's, but it is. And so the idea of post-traumatic slave disorder is that there is psychological trauma that has been imposed upon Black people in America, due to, and actually across the diaspora, due to the brutal and the psychological manipulation that was cultivated during slavery. And I don't think that talking about it is necessarily trying to proliferate it or perpetuate the legacy, but it is saying, hey, this is an issue and you have to talk about it. And so I think that while it can be complicated, because the idea is that, okay, moving on, but for a lot of times, if there is not proper release and proper recognition, it becomes difficult to move on. And so even now with the discussion of reparations, I really think it's kind of distraction, whatever the mainstream, whatever the more dominant things are. And I just have to keep, like, I can't quite put my finger on it. And the reason why I think it's important to look at it, because when you talk about reparations, they're saying if they do a monetary reparation and just give everybody some money, all that's going to do is create an acute influx of capital within the economy. But if you're looking at when they were talking about automation, based on the green industrial revolution, basically, when there's a revolution in industry, what basically has to happen, is that the market has to correct itself. So early economists would talk about this invisible hand. So it happened in the Industrial Revolution. It happened when the primary Southern economic modality shifted from agrarian, based on slave labor and plantation and the buying and sale and trade of cotton, to moving that production up north, where there was a cotton gin that was able to do some of the work that slaves were doing much faster, and then it changed the import and export dynamic in terms of how cotton was shipped, how it was manufactured and prepared. So now if you look at so the idea of climate change, it demands that production changes because chemical emissions are really depleting the ozone layer. So if we want to have any measure of regularity and stability within climate, we have to make the changes. But some of it is costly because you're talking about upgrade equipment and all kind of stuff. Because most of the time when people open up manufacturing businesses, they're looking at getting anywhere from a 15-20 year warranty on their manufacturing equipment. But if now it's saying like, well, that's not the greenest way to do it because of the amount of emissions that's needed, this is the way that you can do it, you have this number of years to do it. Well, it's difficult to manage that and manage overhead and any measure of when there is stress or strain on the economy, when there is pressure, when your competition is outsourcing and it's cheaper to produce in other countries. What is going to encourage people to pay the higher price, except if there is not national allegiance? And so as much as we want to say, oh, I don't agree with the president, I don't agree this, I'm telling you, it is psychological. It's psychologically induced. If we do not have an allegiance to this country, I am telling you, and I know a lot of people are like, oh, well, I want to go and I'm going to leave and I'm going to do this. We have just as much right to be here as anyone else, and the idea is that if outsourcing is a challenge, and outside of outsourcing, if the upgrades like I said, upgrades to create greener businesses, all of those kind of things, it's challenging for businesses to do and then still remain competitive in a market where production is less or is diminished in other countries. So the overhead, with regard to overhead, so if it costs, let's say it costs $1 per shirt to sew and manufacture a shirt in let's say Mexico, for that matter, and then maybe another $1 to ship, compared to what may take us $3 to produce, even if it's $1.75 or $2. If you're talking about mass producing millions of that particular product, you're talking about millions of dollars. So that becomes a lot. So how do you manage and compete and then still hire people? Because at the end of the day, when you go into the store as a consumer, you're looking for the most reasonable price. So in terms of project allegiance and product allegiance and all that kind of stuff like that, it's just important. And so this fallout, whether it be with Trump or whoever, whatever our next president is, if we're not careful, the instability that it will create in the polity can put all of our lives at risk. And so it's really important to kind of be a bit more mindful. And I think that was the thing about the miseducation. It's not just about looking at what's presented to you. It is about being critical. Even, I'm certain that people are going to be critical of me, but I mean, and not critical of me, and that necessarily is bad. You should be critical of any information that you receive, because that's what you're called to do, to question and experience it for yourself. And that's what Carter G. Woodson was speaking about, self-educate. Don't just wait for people to give you answers, really seek the truth for yourself. And then more specifically, when it comes to this, he was like, take our position within the society seriously, because, while we may not be valued by them, we're not valued because they know that we don't recognize our value ourselves. Because if we did, we could maneuver and really position ourselves in a posture to be a force to be reckoned with regard to blocked interest. So and when I mean block interest, so if you look at PACs, political action committees, and you look at interest groups, they really motivate how lobbyists are able to really sway and get legislators to push agenda items onto the floor and get it onto the legislative agenda. So when you and the bottom line is, Congress people respond to their the majority of their constituency. So in any particular district, outside of redlining and some of the other stuff that has happened and gerrymandering, outside of those things, if you look at how our communities are built, if we were able to amass and organize, even if we go across boundary lines and really start saying, hey, these are issues important regardless of what district you're in, we're going to put pressure on them in this area, this area, because the system has to change. And that's the only way we're going to be able to yield change. And so when I'm speaking of change and when I'm talking about the relevance of the miseducation of the Negro in America, what you're really talking about is understanding what is the process of developing authentic diversity and inclusion. What does that look like? For a lot of campuses, for a lot of organizations, it's having dedicated studies program, dedicated cultural studies program, having cultural sensitivity and cultural competence. That goes without saying. But now, what is diversity? Because for a long time it was really like, okay, it was predominantly white, it's not predominantly white anymore, we're good. So when you look at the Thurgood Marshall the Thurgood Marshall movie, that was one of the things. He graduated and then sued, and that was like one of the first cases he was. And so between that and Brown versus Board of Education, really getting it in front of the Supreme Court to argue, hey, it's important and it's relevant for there to be Black bodies in these spaces that you have segregated and basically isolated us from. Now we get on there and it's challenging. You're coming up against all kind of tensions and everything else. And even though people saying, well, it's not avert, it's not this, it's not, even if it isn't, it was embedded in the system in the post-Reconstruction era because it was deliberately done to maintain a particular climate and a particular idea about the way of life in America, but about the way of life it should be. That the European was superior to the Native American as well as the African American, as well as move forward. World War II. Even Asian Americans for that matter. So excuse me, a lot of that stuff, the remnants of that stuff is still here. You talking about you haven't even given it a good, for a lot of it, it hasn't even been 100 years really of really consistent healing. I'm talking about, really naming it, really working through it, because we went through Jim Crow. We went through, fighting against that, into affirmative action, into the crack epidemic, and into, post affirmative action. What does America look like? So it's been so much stuff that we haven't really had time to really delve into and heal. We're still working through it. And so when you go to talking about what is diversity, there are two things that you need to look at. Is it qualitative or is it quantitative? Quantitative is just a numerical summation or a numerical analysis of the composition of the population. When you're dealing with qualitative, you're really dealing with, okay, what is the actual experience? What are the substantive changes in terms of policy, in terms of management, in terms of training, in terms of cultural responsibility and competence? And so if you're not dealing with that, then you're not really dealing with diversity. And that's what Carter G. Woodson was talking about. So when there are cultural studies programs that are really fighting for their vitality, now there's some other issues that I think I'd speak to in some of the other some of the other videos, with regard to financial support and stuff like that, and how important it is for us to really support the programs that we believe in with regard to cultural studies. And that's why I think, when you talk about Black history, it went from a day to a week to, I think it was a day, and then it was a week, and then it was a month. But it really now, Kwanzaa is really 365. Those principles should be the girding force, and not because it's a trending topic, but because it's a way of life. If you want to talk about amassing wealth, everything from Black Wall Street in Topeka, Kansas, to really looking at the comparative wealth accumulated in banks by because if you look at, we don't have really many black owned banks, but the idea is that in order for capital to really amass value, it needs to turn over multiple times within a community. If you're talking about wealth with, aggregated wealth within a polity. So if you talk about the Jewish dollar, the Spanish dollar, and again, I think some people think that I was trying to use code words, but no, when I talk about cultural enclaves, I'm talking about little Haiti, where there is concentrated development across a particular cultural boundary. So even all those little stores or those little places that you can see, when that money is what it is, it keeps the money circulating within a particular community. So now, what does that mean? It means that if we want to have an equitable standing with regard to wealth in America, we have to do the same thing. But in order to do that, we need the education, we need the support. And so then when you talk about reparations, rather there being than just like kind of, because that's what happens. What happens if you run into a room, or if it's in a bar and somebody's trying to do a cover, what do? They just basically, boom, throw money up, easy way, an easy distraction, throw money up in the air. Everybody's chasing after the money, and then whatever needs to go down has already happened. So, and by the time the smoke clears, it's difficult to kind of see what was what. So I think one of the main things is being able to have a systematic approach to the development of a stronger infrastructure, having mandatory behavioral health pieces, and then also behavioral health programs. Because even if you look at this whole new opioid addiction, what it's doing is taking government money and shifting it from some of the illicit drugs, street drugs, that most low income not families, but most low income people are addicted to, whether it's drugs, crack and alcohol, and shifting it to a more middle class type of drug addiction, which is all it's doing is putting the same crack, cocaine disparity with regard to prosecution, is taking that same context and now applying it to treatment. So opioid addiction is, is a drug addiction of, affluence. It may not be high affluence, but it has to be some major, there has to be, some sort of money to get the prescription drugs. And so you just, and pharmaceuticals in America is a big thing. So I think, that's, that's the bigger discussion. And so I really, again, this first video was just supposed to be an overview and a discussion. And so one of the major things, again, in terms of dealing with the overall well-being, psychological well-being of the Black community, you're looking at, dismantling and really addressing miseducation is about really addressing post-traumatic slave disorder. It's about addressing post-traumatic stress disorder, because there is inherited stress. Just like KRS-One had this song years ago, I heard it, and it was talking about why we should be vegetarians and the conditions under which, if cattle, chickens, all of that, if they are not free range and able to like kind of walk around freely, they are under stress of being in a confined space. And when they are stressed, their body releases these hormones that's then into their meat tissue and into the milk, and then we drink it. And so we're basically drinking their stress hormones, and that can create issues within us as well. So in terms of lifestyle, in terms of all of those things, it becomes relevant and important because that takes finances. So even in terms of organic farming and having access to adequate food in regions that have been considered food deserts, it's about saying, hey, that's part of the money we would need for reparations. That's part of the money that's developing the infrastructure of the United States. And if we're not talking about it in that way, then we're not really talking about making substantive qualitative change. We're making a quantitative change. So in the short term, under someone's legislative term, they could be able to say, oh, well, the economy changed like this, but move it forward 2 or 3 terms after that, and we're right back in the same position. And then it comes into these partisan politics. politics? Well, it's the Republicans, it's the Democrats. No, it's overall mismanagement and a lack of investment in terms of the infrastructure of the and developing infrastructure to empower the disenfranchised. So, that's some of the stuff that I think is important. And one of the other things he talked about too is having a role and having a function and just being clear about it. So let me give you the two reflections. Let me actually read what I said here. And I said, for diversity to exist, there must be space and preparation made for proper intercultural exchange by way of development of the multicultural components within any given cultural diaspora, from the study of its ancient inception to its socio-political treatment in modern civilization and society. Therefore, culturally based leadership must refrain from opportunistic posturing and development for the sake of lending themselves to the maintenance of status quo in politics and cultural expression with regard to systemic miseducation or the remnants thereof. So what does that mean? It means that we want to look at creating opportunities for there to be qualitative, truly qualitative diversity. Then we want to avoid quantitative diversity, which often leads to tokenism. And what is that? That's basically saying like, okay, we need X number of black faces, we need X number of X number of black people, we need X number of Hispanic people, X number of Jewish people. Well, what is the qualitative experience? So you can have a mixing bowl, but you really want to be able to have a fusion where you can see clearly intersections. And that doesn't mean that because if you're cooking each element, it's such a beautiful dance. There's this movie I watched, and I can't even remember it, but it was a movie about this about a chef. It was actually, I watched it in subtitles because it was an Asian chef, and she was really kind of entrancing. Well, she wasn't doing it deliberately. She was trying to. She was hired as a personal chef for this man who was, quite cantankerous in terms of his disposition and personality. But he loved her food because he loved the way she played with the ingredients. And he's like, oh, this is this, and you feel this, and you taste this, but this is over here, and this is over here. So what made it beautiful is that each ingredient had its own element, and it didn't lose that. It had its distinction, but it didn't lose that in the development of the common, of the common unity, the plate, the meal, the ending meal. And so I think so often, whether it's about a space or whether it's like, there should be dedicated cultural studies. There needs to be dedicated space. It just does. It's no way around it. And I think that that's one of the important things that we have to look at. And so overall, I recognize, and race is a social construct. The African diaspora is all inclusive because the earliest human remains were found in Africa. So that means that all of humanity started in Africa and then spread out across the globe. So technically, very, very technically, the diaspora is all inclusive. However, the portion of the diaspora that was subjugated and enslaved is very, very specific. So, that's the part that you got to look at. And it was because it wasn't just about, it's like, we are going to wipe out any memory you have of cultural identity of who you were before. And so, yes, some people would say, oh, well, they had slaves in Africa. No. And I know someone said that to me, and I was just like, well, I didn't really realize that they had slaves in Africa. Are you serious? Like, making it seem like, oh, they were already being mistreated. All we did is put them on a boat and change geography. No, that's not what happened. There are social order in many civilizations. And there's a difference in having a social order and saying, okay, you have no position. So you put everybody on a boat. This person could have been a king. This person could have been a chief. This person could have been the judge or whatever. It didn't matter. None of that mattered. You're all on the boat. Everybody going across, everybody getting hit, everybody getting beat, everybody chained together, everybody laying in each other's feces. And at this point, once you get over here, you're no longer even, you're not a human being, you're property. And so I think that how can you expect any people to go through that and not show some sort of psychological damage? I mean, really, it's impossible to think that they wouldn't. So I know that I still struggle with it. Ideas of internalized inferiorization, sometimes challenges. I've grown through a lot of them. I used to feel, insecure about the size of my lips. I used to feel insecure about my complexion. I used to feel, and I talk, and I've grown to love myself, but it still will come up. I would still automatically assume that someone's prettier if they're light skinned. I still work through that. I still work through it. I still have to work through it. And I have to work through it without being like, oh, let me superimpose my confidence by looking for their flaws. And just being able to say, okay, you know, she, I'm, that's what she looks like. This is what I look like. And I'm okay with that. Or that the hair has to be curly. Like I used to struggle, and I like my hair. I like having natural hair. I like wearing braids and so it's this whole idea like, oh, if you wear weave, you don't really know if your hair natural, it means you woke. Look, beauty is beauty, and we're all beautiful. And so when we talk about dismantling miseducation, we're talking about redirecting the components of our aesthetics, of our emotional sense of self, our psychological sense of self, and certainly our political action. And our economic modalities. So I think that all of those things are important. I think it's critical, and I plan to explore it in more in depth over the next 6 videos. So I hope that you enjoy. I hope that there's something relevant that you're able to relate to, and at the very least, it compels you to do some research and join the discussion. So I hope that you have an awesome evening. I hope that God treats you well, and like I love and appreciate you, and I hope you love and appreciate me as well. Be at peace and have a wonderful evening.